We're still talking about what shall we do with the Old Testament. And I talked about how the Old Testament came together. It was originally oral traditions, some of which would have varied from one another depending on the tribe or the people group that kept them, and some of which would have been written down into manuscripts, and then it was all edited together into the Old Testament we have much, much later, sometime between the Persian period and the Maccabees. So that's after the return from Babylonian captivity and during the time between the Old and New Testament. That's when the Old Testament was really put together and edited together. So even if you've heard things like the book of Job is one of the oldest books in the world and it comes from the time of Moses, or maybe it comes from the time of Abraham, it's not. It comes from the Persian period and so on. Now, we will talk about the various books of the Bible, the genres of writing they are of the Old Testament, and how to read and understand them in a later video. But I want to talk about how some of the Old Testament was written down much, much earlier than when I said the Persian period and the Maccabean period. And I've already hinted at that, because I said not only was there oral traditions passed down, but there were some of those oral traditions would have been written down and passed down. So for instance, the priests, the Levitical priests, would have originally, by oral tradition, known what the different sacrifices were. If an older priest was training a younger priest, he would teach him, this is how we do the sacrifice for this, and this is how we do the sacrifice for that. And he would have learned it. But at some point, somebody would have written them down, and that would have been the beginning of what later was expanded into the book of Leviticus. But the first thing that we think that was written down, or that scholars believe was probably the first part of the Old Testament to be written down, would have been an early version of the book of Deuteronomy. Not as complete as we now have it, but an early version. And so what you need to realize is King Saul, King David, King Solomon, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and all the other kings, all the way till the time of King Josiah, none of these people had any of the laws of Moses. I know you might have thought that Moses wrote them all down and passed them on, and they all had them at the time, but that's not how it came about. None of them had any of the laws of Moses. That's why David was not stoned to death for adultery, even though it's in the law of Moses, because that law never came until later on. And it was during the time of King Josiah. Now, King Josiah became the king of Israel when he was only 8 years old. So he wouldn't have known anything. He was surrounded by advisors, mainly the high priest and some of the priests who would tell him what to do and what decisions to make. And then when he is 26 years old, so he's still young, and he's used to taking advice, something interesting happens. It's in 2 Kings chapter 22. And what happens there is the high priest comes to King Josiah and says to him, or sends somebody to King Josiah to say to him, the high priest has found the book of the law in the temple. We were cleaning out the temple and we came across this manuscript, and lo and behold, it's the book of the law. And so they start reading it. Now, this is the first time that there is a written manuscript being discussed. And so this is the first time that we know that some of these oral traditions have been written down. Now, most scholars don't really think the high priest found the manuscript in the temple. They think he probably wrote the manuscript, not from scratch, not totally made up, but based on oral tradition. But maybe he did find it. Maybe somebody else had written something down, okay? So what we're talking about is an early version of the book of Deuteronomy. And what is really convenient for the high priest at the time of Josiah and all the other priests in Jerusalem at the time of Josiah is, up until this point, although there's a temple in Jerusalem, it's not the only place people worship God. All of the villages and towns throughout Israel, north and south, would have had their own shrines. There were priests that lived in that village. There would be a prophet who lived in that area. If you wanted God to bless you, you would go to the priest and say, here, I want to pray and I'm looking for God's blessing. And the priest would say, well, bring a lamb and we'll sacrifice it. But you're like, I get keeping the leg of lamb to feed my dinner tonight, kind of, to feed my family tonight for dinner. So that was the way it worked. Or you would go to the prophet if you wanted a word, and you would give the prophet a gift and the prophet would give you a word. That was kind of like how it happened in that time. And also, they were worshipping Yahweh and his wife Asherah in most of these places as well. But when the high priest gets this manuscript, this book of the law, finds it, writes it, finds it and adds to it, whatever you think happened, and brings it to Josiah, Josiah reads it and it enacts something called King Josiah's reforms. And at that point, they ban Asherah worship and they ban all of the other altars and places of worship throughout Israel. And they say that the temple is the only place that you could worship God. And that all the sacrifices have to come through the priests in Jerusalem, and all the tithes have to come to the temple in Jerusalem. So that would be really convenient for the high priest and the priests in Jerusalem, but not so convenient for all the other priests out there. And that is the beginning of that's the first time we have a written manuscript, and that manuscript later on would have been edited together with the others to produce the book of Deuteronomy that we have today. Now, you can believe all of that and still believe in the inspiration of Scripture. You can believe that God inspired people to pass down oral traditions, that God inspired certain people to write down some of them, that God inspired later people to bring them and edit them together and things like that, and that God has providentially preserved this for thousands of years now so that we can still read it today. That's inspiration, but it's not the same as inerrancy. It doesn't mean that every detail is scientifically and geographically and historically accurate. That's not what it means. Inerrancy is something different. Inerrancy loses the whole idea of progressive revelation. If Moses or King David had the same revelation of God as Jesus, then why did Jesus come and teach us about the Father? No, it was a gradual and progressive revelation until the culmination of the full revelation of who God is in Jesus, in his teaching, his life, his example, his incarnation, his death, his resurrection. Okay? And so you can still believe in the inspiration, but that doesn't mean that you have to take everything as inerrant. Because like we said in a previous video, sometimes in the Old Testament, when they're talking about Yahweh, they are clearly talking about El, the Most High God, but using the name Yahweh for him. But at other times when they're talking about Yahweh, they're clearly talking about a local tribal deity that they don't think can do anything beyond their borders. And so a statement I often use is, the Old Testament reveals to us humanity's projections onto God, as well as God's patient self-disclosure through it all. And anyway, the book of Jeremiah, chapter 8, verse 8 says that there are errors in the Old Testament. Yes, there are incredible things there, but there's also some errors. Jeremiah 8:8 says, how can you say we are wise? We have the law of the Lord, when behold, the lying pen of the scribes has turned it into a lie. or some translations say into a deception. And so there are things in there that reveal the true God, and there's other things in there that are like, whoa, that's not the Father of Jesus. That's not the God I worship. And so we will talk about that in future videos, about how Jesus and Paul, and we can see in their teachings how they accept and validate certain things in the Old Testament, but they dismiss and repudiate certain other things in the Old Testament. So 2 Kings 22, have a read at that. And Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 8, have a read at that. And that will help you understand how the Old Testament came together and how we can believe that God inspired people to tell stories and write stories down and so on, but that it doesn't mean that everything is 100% accurate or describes God as he truly is. Only Jesus did that.